75 minutes in length, which includes a 15-minute Q&A period. To access closed captioning, click on the icon CC Live Transcript on the Zoom control panel. If you experience technological difficulties, please go to the Technical Support Guides area above the schedule on the Symposium page. We're in a Zoom meeting. Please keep your video feature off and stay muted to eliminate any potential distractions during the presentation portion of our session. We would love for you to tweet out or share on social media all that you are learning from the Literacy Symposium. So the hashtag for the symposium is hashtag PatentLit2022. That's also posted in the chat as well. And now we would like to introduce to you Dr. David Kilpatrick.
Okay, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds good, Dr.
All right.
Kilpatrick.
For the next hour, we have a rather ambitious schedule here. First of all, I want to spend the first third of the presentation just summarizing some of the most important findings. A lot of this might be familiar to a lot of you and maybe new to some of you. And then I'm going to spend the next 2/3 talking about how we get other people on board. To give you I'll be giving you some background, mostly drawing from an area of psychology called social psychology. Social psychology has been described as the psychology of the normal, in the sense that it studies why people do the kind of things they do and why we think the way we think and why we believe what we believe. And we'll also be doing a little bit of a philosophy of logic, but don't worry, it's not, I won't be going over your head with any of this because I'm not that smart. So, but I'm a little bit of a philosophy buff, philosophy of science, and we'll talk about that as well. And I think you'll find this all very interesting and informative because it's very useful, and you'll find that it applies to a lot of other things in life other than just trying to get people to adopt the best, most effective practices in reading. Okay, here's some of the most important findings. The alphabetic principle. Excuse me, the alphabetic principle is the notion that our alphabetic writing system is based upon the sounds we make when we speak. The simple view of reading, probably most of you have heard this by now. It is the only major overarching theory that covers all the different areas of reading research. Orthographic mapping is the process of how we remember words, which is so central to understanding reading, because when we read, words jump off the page. There was a time when those words that we see, we didn't know, and we had to figure them out by sounding them out or guessing or ask the kid at the desk next to us, but then eventually we remembered it. So how is it we remember words so we become so competent? The phonological core deficits, one of the most important findings of the reading research, and hundreds, really thousands of research studies looking at why it is some kids struggle in reading. And then the benefits of code-based instruction, why it's important to do phonics and phonemic awareness with kids to make them better at word level reading. All right, so I'm going to summarize each one of those. Writing was around for a long, long time before the alphabet. And you had Chinese writing, you had cuneiform, you had Egyptian hieroglyphics, where each of the characters represented a concept or a word or an idea. But alphabetic writing was quite different. With alphabetic writing, you're not writing words, you're writing phoneme characters. You're writing individual units of our language, individual sound units of our language, and you're stringing those together to form a word or to represent a word. So the flow of speech is being represented by the order of the letters in writing. And that's what alphabetic writing is. It's very different. And if you have poor access to the phonemic structure of the spoken language, you're going to have a hard time learning to read an alphabetic-based writing system. And even though most people will recognize that knowing about phonemes and sounds is important for sounding out words, it's not so obvious that it's also important for remembering words. And that's the orthographic mapping explanation helps us understand why that is. The simple view of reading, again, you're probably very familiar with this. The simple view of reading never claims that reading is simple. Those that study the simple view of reading and those that originally proposed it know that reading is very complex. Where the word simple comes in is the idea that all of that complexity related to reading can be categorized under two different general skills. The ability to understand the language in which something's written. So, for example, if somebody read something to you, you would understand it. And the ability to efficiently read the words off the page so that you can understand it. If you can't read the words, you can't understand it. And there's very little overlap in terms of the cognitive or linguistic or even academic skills that relate to each one of these. And just to give you a little bit of the idea of the complexity, and also will help to lead to an upcoming slide. If we take what I just mentioned, your language comprehension, your word level reading, what are those based on? What is word level reading based on? Well, you have to be able to sound out words, and you have to be able to build an orthographic lexicon. What's that? That's just a fancy word for sight word vocabulary. In other words, familiar words. You have to build a data bank of familiar words, and that's how we read and why we can move through text very quickly, because words pop out at us. Okay, well, what are those based on? Well, for phonetic decoding, to sound out a word, you need to be able to blend, and you need to have letter sound knowledge. So you see a word like sat, and you look at it and you go sat. And in order to know that it's the word sat, you have to blend those sounds together. So letter sound knowledge and phoneme blending. To build the orthographic lexicon, we use a process that has been referred to by its developer as orthographic mapping. You need to be able to pull apart the sounds of pronunciations and align those with the order of the letters on the page. You need to make, there's a connection forming, graphophonemic connection forming process that occurs to store those in memory. Now, we're not going to talk about language comprehension today, but there have been some big findings related to that. I cannot more strongly recommend a book than O'Kill, Kane, and Elbro, Teaching and Understanding and Teaching Reading Comprehension. Get a copy of that. If you haven't already got it and read it, read it. And they cover all the kinds of things that you see up here that go into language comprehension. Now, what you saw on the previous screen was that we broke word level reading down into two different skills. The first is the ability to identify an unfamiliar word. That's so important. That is something all skilled readers can do. And the ability to remember words. You're not going to become fluent if the words aren't, too many words are unfamiliar that you're reading. So these are the two skills, and we need to understand what goes into these and why some kids struggle. Now, the interesting thing is, even though you can have some children that are skilled at both of these and children that are weak at both of these, but you can also have kids that are poor at the second. They're not good at remembering words, but they're pretty good at the first. Those are usually kids who are phonic trained, but they have the phonological core deficit and their phonemic skills are still inadequate. Let me show you how that works. What you have here is a scatter plot that shows, that's trying to represent two skills. Two different tests were done, each trying to get at two different skills. Across the bottom where you see nonsense words, that was an effort to estimate code knowledge, how good children are with that first of the two levels of word reading, the ability to sound out a word. The second one, you see the exception words and the vertical. That was intended to estimate how many words were familiar to children, because they gave them words that if they didn't already know them or hadn't seen them before, there's no way they were going to sound them out because they're so irregular. Words like bouquet or yacht. And look at what the pattern they found. The kids that were pretty weak at the code of sounding out words were also the ones that didn't do too well with memory for words or hadn't accumulated words in memory. Then you had children who were really good at sounding out words, and those kids were the ones that were really good at remembering words. But then you had another group. You had children who were really good at sounding out words. They're in the top half of that, but they are in the bottom half of the apparent ability to accumulate words and remember those words. But look what's missing. In other words, we don't see kids, kids can kind of fake it through kindergarten, maybe into first grade by some sort of visual memorization, but eventually that comes back to haunt them because there's so many words in English that look alike. But you don't see children who are really good at remembering words and don't have a good base of knowledge with the code. We just don't see that, okay? Now that looks like a little bit of an old scatter plot. The reason is that research studies rarely put scatter plots in. They'll just give you a number. So they'll say, oh, the correlation here was 0.77, which it was in this case, and it won't tell you much of anything about the pattern. So that's why I went back for that. By the way, the new Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, 4th edition, has tests just like this, and I have seen the scatter plots, and they look virtually identical to this, and that's from 2020. So this isn't old news. It's old news, but it's not old information. It's pretty current. As I mentioned, orthographic mapping, that's the process we use to remember words. It applies to parts of words. So we are storing words in the background and chunks of words as well. And that's why if you have a young child who's in 3rd grade and they're a good reader, and you present them with a nonsense word like NALK, they instantly say knock. But a beginning 1st grader or mid 1st grader is going to look at that and say nelk. The reason is that 3rd grader has already stored in long-term memory walk and talk. So the ALK has been stored as a unit as well. Orthographic mapping is that mechanism we use to build the sight vocabulary, the lexicon, and it occurs through that graphophonemic connection forming process that I described. We're attaching something new that we're trying to learn, which is that sequence of letters, to something we already have stored in long-term memory, and that's the word's pronunciation. And we do that by making the connections with the phonemes in that word's pronunciation. Other than visual input, it's really not, it's orthographic learning. It's not visual memory, it's orthographic learning. Yes, the information goes in visually, but we have at least 3 different aspects of our memory that involve information coming in through our eyes. Face memory and orthographic memory, that is memory for written words, and visual memory. And we see different activation patterns in the brain between all 3 of those. So the fact that it comes in through our eyes, we don't assume that it is visual memory. In fact, we don't have much information to suggest that it is visual memory. It's orthographic memory. It's the order of the letters that is remembered, not the visual look. That's why you can instantly identify a word regardless of the font it's in, whether it's uppercase, lowercase, etc. And as mentioned, it requires strong code knowledge, because for that graphophonemic connection forming process, you need to have good knowledge of the code for that to happen. So really, if we want to summarize what skilled reading looks like, you've probably also heard of David Scher's self-teaching hypothesis, and he points out that if you know 20, 30, 50, 70,000 words that are stored away in your long-term memory, our teachers did not teach us all those. Most of those we taught ourselves through reading. We encounter a word, we figure it out, we move on. But in the meantime, through this orthographic mapping process, those words are being logged away into long-term memory. So here's how it works with English. We see an unfamiliar word. Here's how we got up to 30 or 40 or 50,000 words. We see an unfamiliar word in text. We could have been in 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade, 9th grade. Could have been a few weeks ago when you came across some new word you've never seen before, some technical term or something. So you see an unfamiliar word. Using phonetic decoding, you sound it out. And if it's a nice, neat and tidy, phonetically regular word, you get a direct hit, and there you go. You've accurately identified the word. So that's that first level of word reading I talked about. But we know English, too many of the words are not nice and neat and tidy. So we have to do a little bit of extra work. Classically, in phonics instruction, it's referred to as a close phonetic approximate. So you hear this child sounds out W-A-S-H, wash, wash. Well, what does that kind of remind you of? How about the word wash? That's a close phonetic approximate. So something called set for variability kicks in. And set for variability is our ability to properly identify a word that has not been pronounced precisely the right way. And so if we sound out a word that's not completely regular, it's sort of like a mispronounced word in a sense. And then we have, and you can still identify it. So if we look at the regular words, and then add to that words that are close enough, we can identify a lot of words. This is how we did it on our own without our teachers teaching us most of the words we know. But then there are other words that are very irregular. Those are words like yacht, where if you sound it out, you're not even going to be close. So set for variability is not going to help there. Also, I'm talking about 2 different situations here in this box. Also, you have words that are ambiguous, and those are words like present or present, dove or dove, lead or led. There, you need context. There's no other way. You're not going to know if it's present or present if it's just all by itself. You needed context to know which pronunciation it is. But notice how context, look where it is in this. This is the caboose. The engine is the phonetic decoding, sounding your way through the whole word. then that puts you right close within striking range of allowing context and you're set for variability to help you to determine. And then you figured out the word. This is what we do, and this is what we've done, and this is how we got to where we are. Then once we know the word, that's when orthographic mapping can kick in. So, phonetic decoding will allow us to determine the word, but we can't match a word to our pronunciation if we don't even know that we're looking at. So we have to phonetically decode it. We have to determine the word. And then once we know the word, then the orthographic mapping can kick in. We can do that graphophonemic connection forming process that allows us to anchor those strings of letters to the pronunciations that are already stored in long-term memory. And these are, excuse me, and allergy season here. These are the skills that go into phonetic decoding. You need to be able to know the sounds that are associated with the letters, and you have to be able to blend. And then skills that are associated with set for variability. Kids with stronger vocabulary do better with set for variability, which makes a lot of sense. There's more to choose from when they hear a word, wash. If the child doesn't have wash in their long-term memory, then they're not going to think of that. And then context, of course, is going to require background knowledge and vocabulary. These are not that easy to teach, although we really should be teaching both. And then for orthographic mapping, when you think about when that happens when we come across the word. Let's say if we have 50,000 words in our data bank of familiar words, our orthographic lexicon, and our teachers throughout our 12 years of school taught us only 1,000 or 2,000 of those. The other 48,000 we learned in context through this process here in the upper left. And that means that when we came across it, we saw it. Once we knew what it was, we didn't run and get flashcards. We didn't stop and study it. We didn't do that 48,000 times. Those words went into our long-term memory through a latent process. In other words, in the background and rather unconsciously. So the process, that mapping process, has to be lightning fast, and the skills that provide for that. So that graphophonemic processing that happens so quickly means that the phonemic processing has to be automatic, as well as the letter sound processing has to be automatic. And that's how we do orthographic mapping. If we don't have that kind of automaticity, then we are not going to build that sight vocabulary efficiently. All right, in terms of dyslexia, there are a lot of definitions out there. I think one of the best is what you see at the International Dyslexia Association. In fact, a lot of states now have definitions, and some of them borrow directly from the IDA's definition. And here's a basic definition that you see in studies of dyslexia. Word level reading difficulty despite adequate opportunity and effort. That seems pretty simple and skeletal, but that's about it. And of course, it's not due to blindness and deafness, etc. So poor word level reading is how we define dyslexia. Most of the other things that have grown up around dyslexia are part of popular lore that's been around for a long, long time. And a lot of researchers are switching over to a different term. Same concept, different term, and that's word level reading disability. A great book, by the way, if you want to delve into all of this, is Learning Disabilities by Jack Fletcher and colleagues. And I've been using that for many, many years in my Psychology of Learning Disabilities class. It's not written as a textbook for students, but they're handling it just fine. It's written for professionals like those of us out there working in the field. And they've done that. They've largely gone over to that term, word level reading disability. And it makes a lot of sense because it doesn't have around it all the folklore about dyslexia, number one. And number two, you can apply it across different situations. So you have a child that has low intelligence, you can talk about word level reading disability, but in the past, dyslexia tends to have been reserved for kids with generally normal verbal skills. But yet it's the same reasons why they're struggling in reading. So that was a little bit of an odd practice that we had for so long. So there you go. A problem that we'll always have, and a problem researchers will never solve, is where to draw the line. Because everything related to reading falls on a continuum. And so people have to make a decision as to where they're going to draw the line. There's not a clear break, so to speak. What causes this? What causes poor word level reading? Well, the most common cause for years was referred to as the phonological core deficit. But in a review of the literature on dyslexia, some authors who all at the time were from Florida State University, which is one of the funding hubs for the NICHD, for this type of research. They said, although some individuals with dyslexia have weaknesses in a variety of areas, impaired phonological processing appears to be a universal cause of dyslexia. And there's the citation. And why would they say that? Well, first of all, here are a listing of the elements of the phonological core deficit. Now, some people might, group together the first two and then split up that last one into two. So it's the same stuff. They just may organize a little differently. Children with the phonological core deficit, by its very definition, they do poorly on at least one of these and usually more of these. Some kids, all of them. Children that don't struggle in word reading, these kind of things are so easy for them, okay? So that's one of the reasons why they refer to it as universal cause. And a second reason is because other causal aspects have been studied, or potential aspects have been studied for a long, long time, for decades, and we haven't found any, okay? Now, this really shouldn't be a surprise given the phonemic-based writing system that we have. So the fact is, our writing system is based on access to the phonemic structure of the spoken language. And so if children have difficulty, or adults have difficulty accessing the phonemic structure, they're going to struggle in reading. We have 4 classic approaches to teaching reading. We can divide them up based upon the unit size that they focus on. Larger units of language or smaller units of language. And teachers are going to mix and match among these, understandably. But let's look at the continuum. And by the way, these have all been studied quite extensively over the years, comparing one to another. We don't have a large cache of studies on all the specific individual techniques that you can use with kids. We don't really have that. We have a little bit of it, but not a whole lot. But we do have a lot of research on whole approaches, whole general approaches. And the first would be the phonics approach, where you're focusing on letters and graphemes, followed by combining graphemes, not the whole word yet, but combining graphemes for the linguistic or word family approach. Then there's the whole word approach that has dominated the teaching of reading for a long, long time, up until whole language kind of took over in the 80s and 90s. And then you have a focus on sentences and paragraphs, like you see in balanced literacy and whole language, big emphasis on context. Notice how, as you go down this list, you're using larger chunks of the language is the focus of attention instructionally. Now, it's interesting, in all those studies, and there are a lot of them that compare one of these and another one of these, the pattern is pretty clear in the research literature that the order you see there is also the order of effectiveness. So in other words, phonics instruction does better than the other 3, and the word family approach doesn't do as well as phonics, but it does better than the other 2, etc. And this really shouldn't be surprising when we stop to analyze the phonemic nature of our writing system. The closer you get, the closer your instruction is to the very nature of our writing system, the better it works, the better results you get. So with that, we have numerous studies on prevention. They were reviewed by the National Reading Panel. There have been others since. And what we find, if we translate the effect sizes, what are called effect sizes that you see in these studies, we translate them into something those of us working in schools hear more often, which would be standard scores. What we find is that if children are taught phonological awareness in kindergarten, in first grade and/or first grade, some studies did kindergarten, some did first grade, you see the equivalent of an 8 standard score point difference between those kids that got this and those that didn't. And by the way, if you review the phonics literature in terms of teaching kids phonics in K1, the numbers are very similar to what I'm showing you here. And you come back about a year or 2 later, that gets about cut in half. So why? Because the children, a large portion of the children who weren't taught phonemic awareness or phonics, figured it out. They had to figure it out on their own. But we have so many children that won't figure it out on their own. So as a result, the children who were at risk, there was a 13 standard score point gain right out of the starting gates, not 8. And as time went on, the groups did not narrow, they widened. So the children who didn't get this kind of instruction continued to struggle, and those that had gotten this instruction had done much, much better as a result. So we get more bang for our buck doing good tier 1 instruction than there's not a good reason not to do it, okay? So what's effective? Doing phonological awareness and letter sound knowledge, teaching that right from the start, okay? Now, in terms of intervention, what I call the phonemic explicitness continuum, the most phonemically explicit condition produced the strongest, my screen is actually obscured by our thing here. Oh, there you go, growth in word level reading skills. That comes from this study. And you notice it's not hot off the presses. We've known this for an awful long time. When you look at the research literature, when there's no phonemic awareness done formally, no oral phonemic awareness whatsoever, you get 0 to 5.85 standard score gains in word level reading. And by the way, the examples I'm going to give you in the minimal group and the next two groups, all using the same yardstick of a word identification test, normally from the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test Revised, which was a dominant test used in the research for so long, probably half or more used that. And the moderate group, if they introduced some oral phonemic awareness, they got better results. And it was primarily those segmentation. Now, most kids can segment and blend by the end of first grade. So they really took kids up to an ending first grade level with this. But we have numerous studies to show that if you take into account speed of response and the complexity of a task, that the phonemic skills continue to grow and level out about third or fourth grade. And when that's taken into account, you have much larger standard score gains in word identification subtests, okay? So here's an interesting quote. This is also from that study from the year 1000. It shows you we've known it for a long time. Sorry about that typo, actually, 1999. And I might need to move my, okay. The findings suggest that one-on-one instruction in reading, even if it's consistent with regular classroom instructional program, may not have a significant impact on the core word level reading problems of children with serious reading disabilities unless it contains very explicit and intensive instruction in phonemic awareness and phonemic decoding skills. We should not assume that even skillfully administered one-on-one instruction will have a significant impact on word level skills in children who have serious phonological processing weaknesses if it does not contain sufficient depth of instruction in alphabetic reading skills. And alphabetic reading skills throughout that article is defined, like you see early in the paragraph, as phonemic awareness and phonemic decoding skills. Okay, so that's the major findings that we have from the reading research. And I went a little bit more than a third, so I'm going to do what I can to take it up a notch and talk about how can we convince people. The next 35 minutes or so is going to be from social psychology and a little bit from psychology of logic, but don't worry, it's not going to be too heady by any means. How do we know what's true? Here's a fancy word, I will admit, that you probably don't hear every day, epistemology. Epistemology is just saying, how do we know what we know? And there's a couple different epistemologies that float around out there. One is what's called critical thinking, and the other I call political thinking. In the philosophy of logic and in social psychology, political thinking, the term I'm using is called motivated reasoning, and I'll explain the difference. With critical thinking, you try to use the best available information that you have and then use the best logic to evaluate that information. But a third thing is important, keeping checks and balances on our own bias. As we'll see, there's some psychological principles there that help us understand our own bias. The goal is to find out what's actually true. You want the best data, you don't want your own views to skew that, and you want sound logic. That's critical thinking skills, okay? It's the foundation of science. Science is founded on critical thinking skills. Interestingly, one of the central tenets is humility. You have an idea and you're putting it out on the chopping block scientifically, and you have to be willing to say, turns out my idea was not a good one. So if you don't have much humility and you're just going to keep plowing forward, regardless of evidence, that's not critical thinking skills. Okay. All right. Now we talk about motivated reasoning, or what I call political thinking skills. Why do I call it political thinking skills? Simply because it's so prevalent in politics, all right? The goal of political thinking isn't to determine what's actually true. Why? Because you already know what's true. Your side of the aisle, so to speak, your political view is true, and it's the other people that got it wrong. So the goal is to defend what you already believe to be true. there's no sense of trying to deeply evaluate to make sure that what you're thinking is correct. That just doesn't, that's not a part of it. You just accept that. So what your goal is now is to persuade others, and power is to get laws passed or convince people to do certain things a certain way. So really the goal of motivated reason or political thinking is to get the world to be the way you'd like it to be, okay? Now we have to be aware that most domains of society have politics of this sort. Could be the home, right? And it's not always bad. You need leadership, there's no question. But, and there are some issues that are settled. It's like, when the kid asking about this or that, and they can ask a million questions. And finally the mom or dad says, because I said so, okay? Well, it's more political thinking than critical thinking, but sometimes it needs to happen. But in any context, homes, schools, businesses, clubs, et cetera, they have that. They have rules, they have ideas, and then they have a defense of those ideas. So it's easy to slip into political thinking. I think we all do it. I can't imagine any of us not doing this from time to time. The reading wars, of course, have functioned as the politics within education. Whole language, whole word approach was before whole language, phonics, et cetera. So what I think we need to do, and I think we can all agree on this, is to benefit children. We want to know what's best for them. Everybody wants the best for children. We just have different ideas on what's the best. So we should apply critical thinking skills, not political thinking. Well, how do we avoid political thinking? Because we're all susceptible to it. If we think we're immune to it, we are at the greatest risk of falling into it. So we have to be keenly aware of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of the key elements of political thinking or motivated reasoning. Logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are the foundation of political thinking. They're very convincing sounding. They sound like they make sense, and they convince people, okay? But they have inherent flaws in them that, now I don't know if, yeah, okay, my screen froze. I hope you heard me okay. They have some inherent flaws in them that show that it's not able to demonstrate, thank you, it's not able to demonstrate or prove what they're trying to prove. But people listening to this, as well as the person making this argument, thinks that they have just proved or demonstrate what they're trying to prove, okay? And they're very persuasive. And whichever side of the aisle you are politically, whichever side you are on any particular issue outside of politics, there's going to be a lot of arguments that are very persuasive but may not hold up to logic, okay? This may not be a surprise from what I've already said, but a huge proportion of statements, when you look at the things I'm going to tell you, and by the way, there are whole websites devoted just to logical fallacies. You can just Google that, you can spend a whole evening on that. Once you know what these are, watch politicians, watch what they say, and you can just check boxes of how they do that. It's all about persuasion, okay? Here are some of the common logical fallacies. First, I'm going to list them, then I'm going to take you through them. And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, I'm going to give you illustrations from this whole issue of applying reading research and people that are defending approaches that really aren't well supported by research. I'm grouping together three classic ones because they function similarly: the argument from authority, the argument from consensus, and the argument from tradition. I'm grouping together three others that have a similar impact, and that's what's called the origin fallacy, or fancy, the genetic fallacy, or these are the ad hominem, and simply name calling. We don't really have a separate word for this, but you'll see how that works, and it fits in with these other two. The straw man argument, equivocation, poisoning the well. These will all become clear, and these are all very easily understandable. You just may not know these terms yet. False dichotomy, hasty generalization. I know these all sound like big terms, but they're simple concepts. Red herring and special pleading. And they interrelate with each other, and they overlap in some ways. Okay, so arguments from authority, consensus, and tradition. Basically, they appeal to experts, or they appeal to popularity, they appeal to common practice. We've always done it this way, or everybody's doing this, or the experts tell us this. Well, consensus, so that second one, and the third one, tradition, they don't establish truth. Here's one of the problems with the first one, is experts usually get it right. But the key word is usually, not always. One of the most famous cases is whether you went to medical school at Johns Hopkins or Harvard or Stanford, you learned that ulcers were caused by stress. Well, a couple of Australian researchers came up with the idea that ulcers were caused by a bacteria, and the rest of the medical community thought they were wackos. And guess what? They ended up getting a Nobel Prize in medicine. And now if you go to medical school, you realize that it's caused by a bacteria. So the fact is the experts were wrong. Not only were the experts wrong, but it was common practice, it had become tradition, and it was popular, it was consensus. So consensus by itself, even among experts, doesn't guarantee anything. I am a real buff to read about the history of science, astronomy, physics, chemistry, all those different areas. And you follow that history right up through the modern times, and you see that, yes, from time to time, expert consensus can be wrong. So that's why we have to keep going back to the data and looking at the data. And then what about, and this is true throughout the history of science, but even now, what about when experts disagree, right? So a lot of the time it's because we don't have sufficient data, and people are looking at the exact same data and coming up with different solutions. Sometimes we're looking at the classic, looking at the different part of an elephant and describing different parts of it. That can happen too. But we always have to go back and check our epistemology. In other words, what are we going to rely on to say that this is what I think is best? And by the way, we're always going to be tentative with scientific information. We don't talk about it as being the final word. There are a lot of things that have stood the test of time. So it doesn't mean things are changing constantly and we have to be changing constantly. It doesn't work like that. But we still have to be tentative and realize that we can update and improve some of our thinking on particular topics. So here's something, I'm going to come back to this later, but why would we adopt an epistemology that we wouldn't accept in other contexts? So as I go through these logical fallacies, once we understand what they are, we wouldn't expect someone, if you're on one side of the aisle of politics or one side of an issue, whether it's in reading or anything else, you would not accept something based upon all these logical fallacies. But why would you or I use those same things? And that's called special pleading. We'll come back to that. Special pleading is more or less expecting people to accept something without adequate basis for it. Then you have the ad hominem argument, or the fancy term is genetic, but it's also called the origin fallacy and name calling. So the ad hominem is Latin for at the person. So rather than attack the argument, what all of these do, all three of these serve the same function. And that is, I don't need to even address the argument. I can dismiss it by attacking the person, attacking where it came from, or slapping a name on it. And therefore, as a result of slapping that name on it, dismissing it. So these are all ways of easily dismissing an argument without actually dealing with them. So you attack the person, you don't have to deal with their argument. Another thing that we see commonly, and we also see it in politics, is attack the person's motives. So, think about which side of the aisle you may happen to be on in politics, and notice how the other side, they all have a vested interest in things. Your side, no, you're doing what's best for the country, but the other side has a vested interest. So we attack the motives. That works. It doesn't matter which side you're on. It works both ways. Okay, it's a psychological phenomenon. Okay, so some big company shows up and is advocating for some kind of thing in front of Congress. Congress has to listen to their arguments. You know what? That company may benefit from what they're putting forth. That doesn't make it true or false, right? You have to look past that. They may be 100% true, and the fact that they're going to make a lot of money off it doesn't really weigh into it. The origin fallacy is where you question the source. Oh my gosh, this such and such this view was espoused by this person or that person. Well, let's look at the argument. Let's not look at who originally said it. Whoa, this person, they're at a school board meeting, and you say, yeah, this is an idea that came up, and he's the village drunk. Okay, that's a little bit of ad hominem, but you're also looking at the origin. It came from some questionable source. Okay, it may have come from a questionable source, but do you know that all of science is based on some, not all of science, huge amount of our physics is based on some dude that was just a patent clerk back in the turn of the last century. Okay, his name was Einstein. So he some patent clerk. He wasn't a professor anywhere at the time. So the origin fallacy, you can dismiss something based upon where you think it came from and not address the argument. And the same thing with name calling. I don't need to address the argument if I just call it wrong-headed. Well, that's an ill-informed view. That's wrong-headed. You know what? Now I don't have to address the argument. That makes no logical sense. You still need to address the argument. You explain why the argument is inadequate if you don't agree with it, or why it doesn't have sufficient data. Straw man argument. This is huge. This happens all the time as people, as people, and I'll give some illustrations from reading, as people debate topics. A straw man argument, the idea is you present an incomplete version of it, or a distorted version of the viewpoint that you're trying to address. And it's very easy to knock down a distorted or misrepresented view. Very easy. That's why politicians, when they give their speeches, they can say these things so strongly because they're misrepresenting the other side. But then you get into the debate, and now they can't get away with that type of thing quite as well, because the person is right there, and the person says, "That's not what I said," right? And so what you're doing is you're arguing against a view that often does not even exist. But it sounds like it exists because you're creating the impression that it exists, and then it's easy to knock down that viewpoint. So it's persuasive because it fires up the base. In other words, people on either side of an issue, they hear that the other side says this, and you get all up in arms about it because it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Well, of course it doesn't. Nobody actually believes that. It's a misrepresentation. Okay. So here's an example from the reading, is folks that criticize applying scientific findings to reading will say, oh, they're just all interested in phonics. I don't know, who's just interested in phonics? Find that person. Where's the person that's only interested in phonics? And we'll sit down with that person and tell them that, you know, teaching reading is way more than just phonics. Yes, you need phonics. Phonics is, but if you don't like phonics and you don't like that people are going to start teaching phonics, you can use a straw man argument and dismiss people by misrepresenting the view. I don't know of anybody that is only interested in phonics when it comes to teaching reading. I've not come across that person. You know, what's really, anyway, I just said that more or less. What's really interesting, and it's on, I think it was 2018, maybe 2019, there was a phonics debate down in Australia. And Ann Castles, representing scientific findings, got up and said, by the way, the other side is going to say we're only interested in phonics, and we're not. And she articulated that that's not accurate. Well, wouldn't you know, the person from the other side got up and couldn't even get off script and said, they're only interested in phonics, right? So that kind of illustrated my point very well. So you combine straw man with ad hominem, you attack the person, you misrepresent the view, and that's how you convince people. This one is interesting. This has happened on multiple occasions. You know, researchers are only interested in getting grants and getting their academic tenure and promotion. They don't have any concern for kids, all right? Dr. Linnea Airy, in an article from 1998, talked about some of the things that she's been up against over the years, and how publicly, right in front of a whole group of people with her in the back of the room, a presenter, you know, pointed to her and her colleagues and said that that they're only out for themselves. They don't care about kids, but that particular individual cares about kids, and all those teachers do. So it can get pretty nasty, as you know. All right. And equivocation, this is something we need to watch out for. And you've all experienced it. You know what this is. You probably didn't know it had that name to it. But that's when a word gets used differently by folks, and it confuses people. So for example, you hear people say, oh, you know, folks that have not been promoting scientific findings will say, yeah, we rely on research. But what they really mean is watching kids in their classroom and taking notes and creating impressions watching that, all right? You know, qualitative research does have a place in science in general, but it's a starting point that you then follow up. It's a great way to generate ideas that you then go on and test more rigorously. But qualitative research cannot answer causal questions, cannot answer the questions very well. So if we just stop at qualitative research, then there are going to be many, many open questions that we don't have answers to. So that's why we narrow it down with other types of research designs. And by the way, just so you know, in science, and we use terms in different ways, and that's fine. So I'm not trying to say you can't use research in the way that it gets used popularly, but in the sciences, research doesn't mean read up on something and get to know about something. That's a more popular definition, and it's fine. I'm not trying to challenge that. You know, students all the time will say that, oh, I did research on it. What they meant is they read a bunch of articles for their paper that they had to write for their class. Teachers will say, I did some research on it, and that means they read some books that covered research, all right? But the point I'm trying to get at is we have to be careful about how we use words and what words mean. Equivocation is when the the same word is used in different ways, and it creates miscommunication. So you hear people say, well, we do phonics. Yeah, we do phonemic awareness. Well, okay, so they taught letter names and letter sounds. Everybody does that. All the classic approaches do that, at least in the United States. I've heard in Canada that only the phonics approach does that, and the other approaches don't really do that. I don't know that that's true all across Canada, but I know in some areas that's true. But here in the States, it seems to me that all the approaches teach letter sounds and letter names, but what do you do with it? Only the phonics approach then uses that and gets kids to learn about how to apply it, and they get to practice it, etc. The same thing with phonemic awareness. So they do a little bit of rhyming, a little bit of syllable stuff. That's not phonemic awareness, okay? That's not what the studies show. Okay, so let's see here. Poisoning the well. This is when people say things about something, about a viewpoint or an idea or concept to get people afraid of it. And it's throughout politics. What are all the negative attack ads? The negative attack ads, the formal term for that is called poisoning the well. Who's going to want to drink from a well when someone says there's poison in it, right? And so opposing viewpoints get demonized or presented in an unflattering way. Did you ever notice that, in political ads or whatever? And unfortunately, we have news on both sides that are biased on both sides. And if the news is presenting someone that they're not favorable toward, notice they get the picture of them with their mouth half open and they kind of look a little bit goofy. But then if it's someone that they like, they get a really nice composed picture, right? So anyway, to present an unflattering view or even demonize them. And so this way you can dismiss that other view because, oh, who wants someone that's going to ruin society that way? Who wants something that's going to ruin reading? So what are examples in reading? Ever heard the term barking at print? That's poisoning the well, right? What does barking at print even mean? I know what the intent was, is to suggest that kids can read the words, but they don't know what it means. And of course, that has nothing to do with the type of reading instruction that has children that can read the words just fine and don't understand what they're reading. There's a language problem going on there. It has nothing to do with the how you teach reading. And word callers. And another key one is turning kids off to read. Turning kids off to reading. That's poisoning the well, because it's not true, right? Kids get turned off to reading when they can't read. But when kids can learn to read and they can take the steps needed. Can you imagine, let's translate this to other domains of life, because I don't know of other domains of life where that even makes sense. Can you imagine saying, oh, we're turning kids off to basketball because we're doing some dribbling drills and we're doing some free throw shooting practice. We're turning kids off from basketball. I don't think so. It doesn't work that way. There's certain skills that you need to develop. And as kids develop those skills, they get very excited, they get to apply them, etc. So anything negative that can be said about something that turns people away from it, that's called poisoning the well. It also works hand in hand with a psychological principle I'm going to talk about called inoculation. Inoculation is where you say certain things and do certain things that prevent people from even understanding or clearly being exposed to another viewpoint. I'll come back to that. A false dichotomy. The classic false dichotomy is when someone says, oh, do you walk to school or carry your lunch? Well, those aren't opposites of each other. So when two concepts are presented as incompatible and they're not incompatible, that's a false dichotomy. And this is so common. And it's like, well, do you want to teach kids phonics or do you want to teach them to understand what they're reading? That's a false dichotomy. In fact, here's what's fascinating. Those 4 different approaches to reading that I outlined earlier, the first 2 of those have been traditionally referred to as code-based approaches, the second 2 meaning-based approaches. And the irony is that by the end of 2nd grade, kids that are taught through a code-based approach have better access to the meaning than when they were taught with a meaning-based approach. Isn't that interesting? So that, well, why that is pretty obvious. They can read the words, so they can get at the meaning. But the point I'm trying to get at is that demonstrates quite clearly that it's a false dichotomy to suggest, do you want to teach kids to to do phonics, or do you want to teach them to understand text? That's the false dichotomy. And we get hit with that all the time. And of course, that false dichotomy also, notice how I said these interact with each other? Doesn't it sound a little bit like a straw man argument? Yeah, it does. The other thing is, I don't hear this as much anymore, but it still floats around, is that somehow phonics instruction hinders comprehension. Well, I just described to you how research has shown that's absolutely not the case, right? Or that it turns kids into word callers. As I mentioned, if a child can read the words just fine and they don't understand what they're reading, that has to do with one of two things. Number one, it could be a language comprehension problem. But there are some kids that have good language comprehension and they still struggle. And those are kids that are compensators. Kids that are compensators are kids who can create the impression that their word reading is pretty good because they're so darn bright, they have minimalist phonics skills, they've got some set for variability, et cetera, and they can go through text. I just was talking with a mom about 4 weeks ago, and her son is in 4th grade, very, very bright, and fluency comes across very nice, but he cannot understand anything that he reads when he reads in paragraphs. You read anything to him way above his grade level and he understands it. But you look at some of the mechanics of his word reading, his phonemic awareness is horrible, his automaticity, his letter sound skills is horrible. So that's not the cause of the problem. There's another cause of the problem. It's language, or it's that the word reading is not sufficient for them to fluently move through text and get to focus on the meaning. I already said that, didn't I? Jumped ahead. Okay. Interestingly, the little point at the very bottom, we have all kinds of data to show that the correlation between word reading accuracy and reading comprehension is still pretty strong all the way through school years. So those two are related. If you have very poor, now there are kids that are really bright and they're compensators and their word reading is pretty poor and their reading comprehension is still okay, but it's often well below what their language comprehension is. A hasty generalization. We all do this. It's just a very natural human thing for us to do. And that is we draw conclusions based on very limited examples or very limited experience. I just said that, right? Here's an example of that. And this is an old study that was done, I think, back in the 90s in social psychology. They created these vignettes that they presented to people, to groups of people. And one was, at the time of the study, Volvo had the best track record in terms of not needing repairs, right? You didn't have to take it to the shop very often compared to any other brand at the time. And they presented all this data to people about how good Volvo was. And then they presented another vignette to people where a guy meets another guy in a bar and a friend, and he says, I'm thinking about getting a Volvo. It's like, really? My brother-in-law had a Volvo. It was in the shop all the time. Well, the research showed that anecdote was more powerful than all the actual data. So anecdote has a lot of power to it. Those of you old enough to remember, I think, because I used to watch, I don't watch the political conventions anymore. I get so discouraged, but I did as a kid and through many years. And I believe it was George H.W. Bush back, 30 years ago or more, informed by social psychological research, I'm assuming, where he started this thing he called the points of light. But now you hear all the politicians do it. And that is, they say, oh, I know a woman in Indiana and she's having the hardest time trying to get ends to meet. And she's got 4 kids, and where they create anecdotes to try to create impressions. And that I don't think is accidental. That is, campaign planners, they draw on social psychological research, right? So the point is, anecdote is very powerful. We get an impression in our head, we give impressions to other people, and it may be a one-off, or it may represent only 10% of the cases. We don't know unless we have the bigger picture, right? So I know that some of the leaders in the balanced literacy and whole language movement have more or less asked teachers to dismiss all this stuff they're hearing from these egg-headed professors doing research. Look at your own kids. The idea is, if you look at your own kids and you see that they're making all kinds of progress, then that must be working. Now, the fact that you have some kids that aren't making progress, you can dismiss that by saying there's something wrong with those kids. They have a reading disability, they have dyslexia, they have whatever, okay? And then you can excuse things we can always find reasons to dismiss things. Once you have that, that's the problem with motivated reasoning or political thinking, is once you have that idea in your head, you can always come up with some explanation for it. All right. And a red herring. Now I realize I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to accelerate through some of this. A red herring is when people try to divert the conversation away from the main point. And, so it's, when people are trying to react to these scientific findings, they might bring up broader social issues. Yeah, those broader social issues are so important, but socioeconomic status, kids with low socioeconomic status can make large gains in reading when we do the right kind of things, right? So if we blame that and not look at our own instruction, that's problematic, and that's using a red herring by trying to dismiss things that way, okay? Again, my apologies. Special pleading, I sort of defined already. It's when we ask people to accept a view without adequate justification, okay? We want people to accept reasoning that we wouldn't even accept in other contexts, right? So evidence, in favor of whole language is evidence we would never allow our physicians to use, right? Do you want your fish? How about the engineer that designs bridges we go over? Do you want them to use anecdotal and experiential qualitative evidence, or do you want them to have solid, math and physics, et cetera, right? So we would never accept that. Okay, social psychological, I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly, but imprinting, and I'm telling you ahead of time, normally I was gonna do this at the end, each one of these in a sense leads to the next one and results in keeping a view established that may not be well supported, okay? So imprinting is basically saying we develop a schema, that is a way of looking at things based upon our early exposure to something. The first time we get exposed to something could be in college, we learn about something new. And if it makes sense to us, that becomes our schema. And then we defend it from that point, right? It becomes our view of the world. It's our first exposure to it. And this cuts across everything, political views, religion, views of the world, of how we treat people. The way our parents do that kind of set this up for us. But that's also true. You go to college and you hear about stuff. Inoculation is when some of the types of things we just talked about, people have some pre-information. Well, we poisoned the well with this. We've done ad hominem with this, et cetera. You have pre-information, and that affects your perspective. New things that you see get interpreted through the lens of that. Well, actually, we're jumping ahead to that. But inoculation can actually be a good thing. So we don't want our kids, our young kids, we don't want them using drugs, right? So we want to inoculate them against that. We want to scare them. I grew up, when I went to school in the 60s, it was during the drug era, and they scared the heck out of us in school with all these movies they showed us, right? So I got inoculated against ever trying illicit drugs, right? So it can be for good or for ill, but when you're inoculated against good, solid evidence that works better for kids than what you're doing, that becomes really problematic. Again, I apologize, I'm going through some of this. So I kind of started hinting at this a little bit. Confirmation bias, or rose-colored glasses, is when once we have that idea in mind, we now view things through that lens and we see things differently. One of the famous type of studies was the death penalty study, where the individuals that were in favor of the death penalty and those that were against the death penalty watched the same panel discussion. And their interpretations they took away were so different. Even the data, they didn't even remember some of the strong arguments for the other side in some cases. And that was true. Didn't matter which side they were on, same phenomenon, right? That confirmation bias. Some examples: hyperactivity is not caused by eating sugar, but kids that had a party and they're all drinking soda and eating cake, and you think that's making them hyper. No, so they're at a party, for crying out loud. So anyway, investment. So if you've put a lot of time investment into a particular approach, or you are going to be invested in the outcome. And it's very hard late in career to suddenly have a change of view. I've had 2 teachers that have interacted with me and have said, you know what, I'm retiring after next year, and this is all new to me. I'm really excited about looking at this upcoming year and applying this. And I'm like, you know what, that is the best humble approach you can take. I worked 9 years as a school psychologist giving bad advice. I didn't know all of this scientific research. I didn't get up on that until the late 90s. And for example, I helped with the Y-4. I deliberately took zero money, no money whatsoever. So that keeps me from being biased, right? No, I helped, right? You help at the local soup kitchen, and you're going to be biased. So buyer beware. Any comments I say about that test, I help with it, so that's going to affect it. I have no financial interest whatsoever. So investment doesn't have to be financial by any means. Okay. And self-justification, go get Elliot Aronson's Social Animal. Get a used copy for $4. Doesn't matter, anything from the 1990 edition. Every 3 years it gets updated because it's also used as a textbook. It doesn't read like a textbook. It's a great book. Anybody in the general population, read the chapter on self-justification. If we feel that a viewpoint that we have or things that we're doing, if people might think we're foolish or immoral, we have a natural tendency to defend against it. And just go get an old copy. You don't need a new copy because it's, like I said, it's sold as a textbook. It's going to, cost you $80, but you can get any copy from over the last 20 years and read that chapter on self-justification. You will not look at the world the same again. I guarantee you. Read the whole book, by the way. So much of the stuff that you see going on with racism, et cetera, it's going to give you some really good perspectives on how we humans think and why we run into the problems that we run into. It's just great stuff. So we're trying to protect ourselves from thinking that we're foolish or immoral, and yet we end up becoming more foolish or immoral by defending through self-justification, which is kind of odd, okay? Anyway, so what Aronson recommends at the end of this chapter, by the way, is for us to kind of say, you know what, I'm a smart person, I'm a moral person, but sometimes I don't get it right. And when I don't get it right, I need to be humble enough to say I need to change course. And that's how we avoid going farther down a path and getting more invested through the self-justification process, okay? So as I said earlier, each one of these in a sense kind of leads to the others. One builds on the one prior to it, which is kind of fascinating. So how do we convince our colleagues all in 3 minutes here, right? Or 4 minutes? Well, I think we begin with understanding some of the stuff I've been talking about as far as how we can see the flaws in the logic. But I don't think just taking people head on actually works. I think anecdote, we can use that information, the research on anecdotes, creating a buzz. I've seen this happen many times where suddenly one second grade classroom is doing far better than the other 3 at that school. Why? That teacher bought into this approach and she's using it and getting good results. Right now in a school district locally, 11 elementary schools and 1 elementary school is really invested in this, and their results are the talk of the whole district as of just this past week, and because of all the stuff that they've been implementing along these lines. So that's one way to convince someone. You hit them with all kinds of statistics and data, it glides right past them, but you give them good examples and anecdotes. It's kind of sad because anecdotes don't establish truth other than in that situation. But once you have truth, you have that foundation, you can use an anecdote to try to supercharge that, okay? And of course, we want to convince people for ongoing professional development. And we want to promote a constructive dialogue, direct confrontation, my view, your view. So just kind of, if you can see me in the thumbnail a little bit, instead of me and you, I'm saying this, you're saying that. I think a much better way is a collegial way of turning side by side, and the 2 of us are trying to look at the same thing. Let's learn together. And I can learn from you and you can learn from me, okay? And the other thing is we have to be willing to use, we have to use objective descriptions. We have to avoid the straw man argument. We have to avoid the ad hominems. All those things are also a script for us to avoid, as not only that, but to spot in others. And interestingly, when we want to discuss epistemology about how we know, when it's not controversial, it works. I gave 1 talk on politics in my whole life to like 90 people, and they were across the whole continuum. And afterwards, people from both sides were coming up, shaking my hands and smiling. How did that happen? It happened because I never brought up a specific issue, right? I only brought up the epistemology behind the political thinking, and everybody recognized what they were seeing and what they were hearing about. So we can talk to people as long as you're not talking about a specific issue and get them to agree on some foundational things. But at the same time, we need to be able to say, that's a good point. You're making is a good point. Or, I don't know about that. I have to get back to you. We have to be willing to give a little bit of give and take based on the reciprocity principle in social psychology. And so basically a summary, we have a lot of scientific research on teaching reading, and some are more effective than others. And our goal should be to use the most effective approaches. What we've used for the last 35 years has not been as effective. And we need to use the most effective instruction. I'm kind of repeating myself here. And what we can do is understand about how we think and how we formulate opinions, and that can protect us from going down wrong alleys. And it can help us to, when we interact with people, that we better understand their viewpoint, and that we can try to bring them along to understand what they need to learn to do the best for kids in classrooms, because we all have the same goal. So there we go.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kilpatrick. We have